Thank you, Senators. Today we are continuing our study of Bill C-78, an act respecting temporary cost of living relief affordability, which was referred to this committee by the Canadian Senate on December 3rd, 2024. For our first panel, we are pleased to welcome here today, online, Mr. Luc Godbout, who is a full professor, chair of Taxation and Public Finance from the University of Sherbrooke. Hello, Mr. Godbout. And Mr. David Dodge, who is the senior advisor at Bennett Jones, LLP. Welcome, Mr. Dodge. And remotely from Germany, Mr. Sylvain Charlebois, who is a professor and the director of the Agri-Food Analytics Laboratory at Dalhousie University. Thank you very much for being here with us, despite the fact that you had to travel abroad. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to appear today, and we will hear opening remarks from Mr. Godbout, then from Mr. Dodge, and then Dr. Charlebois. And then we will surely have questions. So please go ahead with your statement. Hello, Senators. I would ask you to analyze the bill in greater detail. The way in which the federal government has chosen to change the application of the GST and the HST is very surprising. And politics has obviously won the upper hand over economic logic. If this had been a final project by students, I would have been extremely critical about its relevance, the means used to achieve the objective of the administrative burden for enterprises and the project in general. And I would say that the measure is poorly targeted if the objective is to fight the rise in the cost of living. This bill does not aim at the right people. It would have been more judicious to take another approach without changing the list of projects that would be the focus of a tax relief. As we say, an old tax is a good tax, so you shouldn't really touch it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so when you change the products that are on the list of items that are going to be subjected to tax relief, what is the most surprising to me is, in fact, the products that will be tax exempt. A number of countries around the world have been applying a tax to sweet drinks, and this bill actually creates a situation of tax relief for sodas and for chips. And then there are other things that are surprising. As a tree that looks like a Christmas tree, and how are businesses supposed to interpret that? It includes audio recordings as long as it is the reading of a book that has been printed. So how is a business going to determine that the book exists in print form before removing the tax on the recording? And there's also board games as long as they are for children under the age of 14. But again, what is a business going to do if on the game it says it's for people from 7 to 77 years old? So if the purpose was to help taxpayers, then we know that it would actually, in this case, create more relief for higher income people. Because according to the data that we get from Statistics Canada, what will happen is that when it comes to children's clothing for children under 14, for example, it's about 7% that the richer Canadians will be able to spend and will represent. And so, if you look at restaurant meals as well, it's 3.2 times more for richer Canadians than for poorer Canadians. Then now let's talk about provinces. So provinces have accepted to take the harmonized sales tax, and now they will be losing out. Given the fiscal federalism, now we know that it should have been the case that the federal government should consult the provinces. And it is very difficult to imagine that the federal government can unilaterally decide to change the rules of the game without providing a compensation to the provinces. But now, if we look at the measure's uniformity, so far, when the federal government created time-bound measures to help give taxpayers relief, well, it applied throughout the country. But in this case, with the temporary holiday for the GST and the HST, it will be differently applied depending on the province where they live. So it's hard to justify. The holiday is 5% for certain provinces, but it goes between 13 and 15 points where in the provinces where there's a harmonized sales tax. So, and there's also this side of enterprises. The cost, the administrative cost of these changes is significant. And it's a temporary holiday. It only lasts 2 months. And they will have to change their computer system twice in a very short time period. You cannot, there's also a significant risk of errors when the changes are made, and that will lead to mistakes with the transactions. And then there could be some tax penalties because they did not administer the GST and the HST properly. Finally, the federal government has not yet given an economic update. And in some circumstances, it is acceptable to have a tax break that creates more of a deficit when it comes to climate change, for example, in order to ensure intergenerational equity. But that is not the case when it comes to tax relief for soda pop and chips. So here I would say that in 2 words that the GST HST holiday is bad tax policy. Thank you.
Mr. Godbout, so we continue.
Mr. Godbout.
Mr. Dodge.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. A bit like Professor Godbout, in my view, the temporary reduction of GST on a range of items is poor economic policy in both the short and the long run. In the short run, it entails very real adaptation costs, as Mr. Godbout has just said, for both the government and businesses, which means the fiscal cost is likely to exceed the actual benefits to consumers. And as this fiscal cost is likely to be financed by increased borrowing, the benefit for consumers today simply will result in reduction in benefits in future years as governments reduce services or increase taxes to manage the increased federal debt service charges. In short, Senators, candy today in exchange for future pain. But the long-run implications are even worse. First, the premise of the GST is to have a broad base with as low a rate as possible. Chipping away at that base, even on a temporary basis, makes the tax a much less effective way to raise revenues needed for government programs. The results are that either all taxes increase or programs that support ordinary citizens have to be reduced. Secondly, and perhaps even more important, our collective need today is to raise investment, not consumption. Without increased investment to give workers the tools they need to raise productivity and hence raise the incomes that they are capable of earning, then without providing those tools, we are condemning ourselves to stagnation or even a decline in our standard of living. By opting for a tax measure that increases consumption, the government has foregone the opportunity to increase investments by an equal amount. Senators, I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Dodge. So, on va continuer avec.
Now let's continue with Mr. Charlebois. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for having invited me. I've been to Senate committees a number of times in my career. I've always enjoyed it, and unfortunately I did not have time to prepare notes for my presentation today, but I did submit the annual report for agri-food to the clerk, and has to do with the affordability of food, and this is a topic that I care about a great deal. I believe that you invited 3 witnesses today that have the same point of view. I think that all 3 of us are concerned about what is happening. This issue of how you instrumentalize sales tax is worrisome, particularly when it comes to food. And that is what I would like to talk about now. So the temporary nature of the tax break is problematic. Mr. Godbout said so. We're talking about 100 to 200 hours of work for each business owner twice, and because it'll happen now and then again in February. And it's 4,600 products in an average supermarket that are taxed, and an awful lot of categories. That's a lot of work, a lot of information that has to be taken into account. And I think that what senators need to know is that every year there are more and more products that are taxed because of reduflation. And what this means is that the price of a product is reduced so much that it becomes taxable. And every year we see the number of a product that goes up from 25 to 100 units, and that means that the labor involved increases every year as well. When it comes to retail, the average consumer will save approximately $4.51 over that 2-month period per Canadian. And so that's based on the sales volume and the taxes in supermarkets. So we're talking about $4.51. That's it. That's not a big amount. I would also like to raise this, and Mr. Dodge mentioned it, and that is that there could be some price opportunism. And we saw it under Mr. Harper with the GST reduction. If you look at general inflation data, you can see that in the first months where the GST had been reduced by 1% in 2006 and by 9% in 2008, it leads to an increase in inflation. And that's not surprising because in the area of food, for example, that you try to make up for the money that was not gained in taxes. And so it's temporary, and that could lead to inflation that affects food products. And then at that point in February, the tax will be on those higher prices for food. So when it comes to food items, it's slightly different. It's less work for restaurants. We're talking about 20 to 30% less paid by person over 2 months. And the average Canadian spends about $186 a month on restaurant meals. So it is a nice break, but it'll be different for different provinces. If you look at Quebec and Ontario, in Gatineau, there will be the provincial sales tax. But then on the other side, in Ontario, there will be no tax on restaurant meals. So there is also, that could mean that some people would just cross over from Quebec to Ontario just to avoid the tax. And that could be very concerning during the holidays. So that is about all I have to say at the moment, but I am here to answer your questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Charlevoix. So let us begin with questions. Let's start the round of questions with Senator Forêt. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for your presentations, all of you. They were very interesting. And I would like to ask Mr. Godbout a question first. Mr. Godbout, something that concerns me with this GST holiday is the purpose to have Canadians have more money in their bank accounts after the holidays? If so, why get them to spend so that they can benefit from the tax break? Shouldn't it be an opposite approach? How can you explain that the government is using a tax break rather than something else? Do you understand, and can you explain it to us? Answer. Well, probably it's a visibility issue because they want to find a new way of giving assistance to Canadians. But, yes, just by simply having increased a GST relief measure for everything, then it could have been better for lower income families. They would have had more money. Then they could have decided themselves whether they wanted to buy more or not. And as we have all underlined here, when you play in the list of products that are subject to the GST, it's not a good thing in the short term or the long term. So it would have been a much better approach to do it in a different way. In 2022 and 23, there was a temporary break with the GST, and that would have been better for Canadians. You're telling us that these measures are not targeting the right people. And when you say that, what you're saying that is based on the list of projects that are being detaxed. So really, it's better for the upper middle class or the middle class rather than lower income Canadians. So when you buy products that are eligible for tax relief, the more you buy, the more you benefit. So what that means is that, for example, with tax relief for restaurant meals, if you spend $5 at Tim Hortons, you won't get the same break as if you go to a restaurant and spend $300. So it's clear that when you look at the spending that different households have, well, 20% of Canadians who are richer will be spending more than 3% more in restaurants than lower income households. So there you go. And children's clothing, that's another good example. Richer Canadians can spend far more than lower income Canadians, so they will benefit far more from the break. Do I still have time? Yes. Mr. Charlebois, in your opening remarks, you said that it was possible that business owners might try to somehow get money to compensate for what they're losing. And so then at the end of the tax holiday, then products will be higher in price because of that move by business owners, and then they're going to be taxed on those higher prices. Answer, yes. In our annual report for 2025, there are a few comments on that because we fear that this measure could have an inflationary effect. And when it comes to food, the profit margins are so small that all means are tried to go and try to recover any profit that might be lost. And so really taxes always leave consequences. It's like the tide. You can see the line of the tide that rises on the piers. So you have to be careful. Mr. Dodge, I'm sorry, your time is out or over. And perhaps you can ask another question during the second round. Senator Forêt, thank you. Senator Smith. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
For you, Mr. Dodge, and thank you very much for your entree. Was very a little candy today for a lot more pain tomorrow. I guess the question I have is, where do you believe this funding would be better directed to address the underlying issues of low productivity and stagnant incomes? And the second part of that is, how could a more strategic investment in areas like workforce development, innovation, or infrastructure create a stronger foundation for Canada's economic future and improve living standards for Canadians in the long run?
Senator, as we at Bennett-Jones have argued now for a number of years, that our main problem in the country is that we have low productivity, and hence the real incomes that we as Canadians can earn, in fact, really has stagnated since the great financial crisis in 2010. And so our problem, our collective problem, is to find a way to raise the investment to improve the productivity of workers, and hence to improve their incomes and their ability to buy products. To do that, we need to make investment, both from the government side, investment, and that's investment in the capital services that government provides, transportation and so on and so forth, justice, everything. To complement private investment, which will provide workers with the additional tools that they need in order to raise their income, their productivity, and hence raise their incomes. So that is the fundamental problem that we face, and as we look at the world today, and as we've looked at it since the great financial crisis, what we are doing is we're saying, no, the problem somehow is rising prices. Somehow that's ex cathedra, out of the blue, these rising prices come. Not because what's happened is that our productivity and our ability to pay workers real wages to compensate for the price increases is lower. And so the objective that we should have the government to try deal with what is perceived as the rising cost of living is actually the falling ability to produce and hence raise incomes. And so my view is that this measure, along with some other measures that have been proposed that would increase consumption, whether it's a cash grant, such as Ontario has proposed, or as the minister has talked about federally, or whatever, that's not the issue that's going to make us as Canadians, or enable us as Canadians to have a rising standard of living. And so that investment needs to take place both in human capital, raising the skills of our workers, physical capital, giving them the tools that they have to work with, and government capital, which makes the private investment more productive.
Can I ask another question?
Time is up.
Second round? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Merci, Sénateur Dalphon.
Thank you, Senator Dalphon. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank our panelists. I would like to ask Mr. Godbout a question first, and Professor Charlebois as well. You have talked about the difficulties that will be caused for business owners, small businesses, etc. I think you had experiments that you did at Dalhousie University. But I don't know whether you heard of the sessions from yesterday and the day before, but Restaurants Canada and the Retailers Council of Canada, the Canadian Federation of Independent Grocers, all are in favor of this tax break. They are all ready to jump into the game. They will take on the difficulties that may be caused. The CRA told us yesterday that it will be providing information and will apply the policy knowing that it's temporary with a certain degree of tolerance. Doesn't that answer some of your concerns? And did you take that into account when you gave your theoretical impressions of the situation? Perhaps I can answer first, and then I'll give the floor to Professor Charlebois. You are right, but when it comes to restaurants, the tax holiday is fairly easy to apply. But when it comes to independent grocers, to corner stores, to gas stations, small businesses here, to manage the list of products that will be subject to tax relief is going to be difficult, and it'll have to be done twice, for the 14th of December and February 15th. So that there are costs attached to that, and fine, the CRA is saying that it will apply it with tolerance, but if you make a mistake on a single product and you sell that product 200 times a day, when Revenue Canada comes back to check your records 3 years later and says that you were wrong for 325 days a year for 3 years, well, that can represent hundreds of thousands of dollars by that time. So if the CRA says that if there's a coding error that happens during the temporary period, well, they won't enforce it. Well, that's one thing. But what if what I described happens? Mr. Charlebois, please go ahead. Well, To add to that, I think that I could say that the groups that you mentioned, Restaurants Canada, CFIG, and the Canadian Council of Retailers, are groups that represent a wide variety of businesses. And I think that what I see is a transfer of business from retailers to restaurants, because what we're basically telling Canadian consumers is, listen, go to the restaurant, you'll save money. I mean, restaurant owners are not against that, and I can understand it. But in fact, what is happening is that there is some discrimination happening against retail sales, because restaurants are being favored here. And because we're talking about sales tax, the harmonized sales tax in some provinces, it's going to create some instability. And what worries me is the market distortion that is being created. It's temporary. If it were permanent, I'm not sure that the concerns would be the same for me. In your analysis, and perhaps my question here is for Mr. Dodge, the former governor of the Bank of Canada, but restaurant owners are talking about $1.5 billion in additional sales, but I imagine that there are employees who will be working more hours, and there will be employees who will get bigger tips than they would have had otherwise, and also there are businesses that will be purchasing goods from manufacturers in order to sell and obtain profits of $1.5 billion. So that's an effect that we will see, because it's not just the tax relief and the loss of tax revenue, it's some of that money will be recovered because of the sales that go into it.
That is true in the short run. That is absolutely true in the short run. But unless magically somehow we've generated more production in the country, right? Then over a period of time, in fact, what we have done is shifted consumption into this short period of time and out of future time, and we so that shifting is not helpful, and certainly what it doesn't do is to raise Canadians' real income over time. But it does change the timing. Undoubtedly changes the timing at which some activity occurs.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dodge. The next question is from Senator Lafreda. I would like to thank our panelists for being here this morning.
I do agree, and thank you for being here. It's always a treat. So I do agree that in Canada we have two issues, productivity and competition. But with this measure and this policy, the tax savings, many Canadians need a break. And I think the most important question is why. And you'll see where I'm going with that. Is it not easier to give Canadians a temporary break in such a way rather than, and it's temporary, I stress the word temporary, than investments, which are usually on a permanent basis? And this is a temporary break. Are we out of ideas to create investments that are permanent, that will increase productivity, and or is it the fiscal capacity not to do so?
It's both. It's both. Creating those investments, and those investments have to be created by the private sector by and large. Creating those investments is creating the environment for the private sector to make those investments is not easy. It goes to a range of issues, tax policy. It goes to the issue of government spending on complementary investments. It goes to government programs that support workers to improve their skills and so on. So yes, it is not easy, Senator, and we've been struggling with it, as you say, for a number of years. But what that does not mean that what we ought to do is to think somehow that we can transfer money that we are not producing in the country. Somehow we can transfer money to individuals to improve their situation. The only way that in the end we improve our situation is by improving what we produce. In a sense, as a country, we cannot consume, in the medium term, we cannot consume what we don't actually produce, and our problem in the country is actually production. And you and this committee and the Minister of Finance have been trying to deal with this problem, not just in this government, but in previous governments as well. And just because it is difficult, I think, doesn't mean that we give up. And to the extent each time we run into a problem, we try to compensate by increasing consumption rather than increasing investment. We simply postpone the day at which we can reasonably hope for a permanent rising standard of living.
Thank you for that. Est-ce qu'il me reste un petit peu de temps, Monsieur le Président?
Minute.
Do I have a bit more time? 1 minute?
And I'd asked our other panelists, but Mr. Dodge, given that you're on a good trend here, BMO Economics predicts that the GDP in the first quarter will increase from 1.7% to 2.5%. So that's a positive for Canada. It's a positive for Canadians. Do you feel that that too is temporary and we'll feel it in the second quarter with a reduction in GDP and a possible, because we asked the Minister Freeland yesterday, this is temporary. There's no wiggle room, she told me.
Yeah. So the world is a very difficult world for us as Canadians now. We face a totally different situation south of the border, which is going to make it, predicting what's going to happen in 2025 extraordinarily difficult thing to do. So I don't think we can rely on the fact that as of last October, we thought we might know where we were going. Today, the world is more uncertain. All the more reason not to spend money today on increasing consumption that we may really need in the coming year to deal with very real problems that are being created for us beyond our borders.
Thank you very much. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Lafreda.
Thank you to all the witnesses for being here. And I'd like to hear from each witness on a few questions that I have. So you've all mentioned many problems with this GST holiday. I'd like you to indicate what you feel is the biggest problem with this GST holiday. And if you had one recommendation to the government to address the affordability crisis, what would that be? So I'd like to hear from each of you.
Could start by
Go ahead, Luc.
Mr. Godbout.
Un des enjeux les plus.
Well, one of the main issues is that the tax holiday is not uniform across provinces. So if somebody had asked me a month ago, I would have said that doesn't make sense. It can't be proposed in that way. If it's a 5% break in 5 provinces and then between 13 and 15% in 5 other provinces, that doesn't make sense. It also creates a problem for provinces themselves. They are going to get less tax revenue and they haven't been consulted. So I think that if I'd been consulted before, then the announcement would not have been as glorious, because really it should have been far more targeted, and it could have been assistance that would have been reduced as household incomes increased. And I think that's what experts are saying fairly unanimously.
So thank you, Senator, for the question. Our lab had the pleasure to work with Minister Champagne last year on the food inflation situation. And the one recommendation I gave him was to get rid of the GST forever. Taxing food, in my opinion, is immoral. Taxing food is a regressive method that penalizes the poor mostly in the food sector particularly. Just one example is Newfoundland. They decided to tax soda 2 years ago to discourage people from drinking soda. And this year, sales have actually gone up, not down. People are drinking more soda despite the tax. So they're collecting $12 million in revenues, and they're still dealing with this public health issue. Taxing food is just a bad idea. My recommendation would be to get rid of the GST forever.
Merci. Mr. Dodge.
Well, I totally disagree with the last speaker. Taxing food is perfectly reasonable, and taxing a very broad base is perfectly reasonable because people with different spending capacity to spend different amounts on different things. If indeed we want to deal with the issue and give consumers, quote, a break, remembering that my argument would be that's not the appropriate economic policy at the moment. But if we wanted to do that, then the way to do it is to increase the GST credit. That solves all of the distribution incomes, income distribution issues that the professors have raised, and it solves the administrative issue. It solves the interprovincial issue, so that if indeed you really wanted to give that break, then issue a check as an increase in the GST rebate in January or whatever the next quarterly check is, increase it. If that is the objective, is to increase consumption and people's ability to consume, then that is the tool that should have been used, not this very difficult management tool, the tool that is very difficult to manage, both for the CRA and for the taxpayer.
Thank you for the question, Senator McAdam. Next question, Senator Kingston.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My question is for Mr. Dodge, Mr. Godbout, and possibly Mr. Charlevoix. I'm not sure, but I know for sure that Mr. Dodge will have something to say. I'm looking at some of the things that were talked about at the time that this announcement was first made, and one of them was a statement by Royce Mendez, from the Desjardins Group. And he talked about the effect that this might have on any possible moves by the Bank of Canada. And he said he thinks the cuts and rebates could affect how fast and how far interest rates come down, and believes that this move closes the books on any possibility of a jumbo 50 basis point rate cut in December. Just like you to comment on that.
I think his comment is a perfectly reasonable one. To the extent we increase consumption and increase demand for this period of time, it makes life a little bit more difficult for the Bank of Canada to continue reducing interest rates. But the reducing of interest rates over time from the bank, the precise meeting by meeting reduction doesn't matter nearly as much as where we're headed to towards the end of 2025. And so whether the bank moves by 50 points next week or by 25 or takes a pass really doesn't matter very much in the end. What matters is getting down to 3%, 3.25%, something like that as we come towards the end of 2025, not the particular path that the bank takes.
And that one particular thing would not make a difference overall in where the direction goes?
Very much at the margin, But if government policies as we move forward, and remember we have another addition to consumption coming in Ontario with the $200 handout from the Ontario government. So all those things that are increasing consumption pressures make life more difficult, make it increase the risk. Let me put it that way, not make more difficult. Increase the risk that further reductions in interest rates will lead to higher rates of inflation. So, I mean, directionally, Royce Mendes had it exactly right. Whether the pattern is exactly as he talked about is a different story.
Thank you, Mr. Dodge.
Une minute. 1 minute.
Oh, I don't know if Mr. Godbout had something to add.
Ah, OK. Mr. Godbout, est-ce que vous avez quelque chose?
Monsieur Godbout, did you have anything to add? I have no added value to add after what Mr. Dodge said. Thank you.
Next question, Senator Ross.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not certain which of you might want to answer this, but my colleague, Senator Delphine, did mention the organizations that were in favor of C-78 and the tax holiday. But I would like to note that these same organizations mentioned the administrative burden that small businesses will have to carry. So even if sales may be stimulated, do you think that the potential extra sales would outweigh the cost of the administration of this bill?
So there's clearly deadweight loss here, just in administrative costs, both from the CRA side and from the retailer side. That's absolutely true. I would have thought, and certainly in the case of restaurants, that this is clearly that there are undoubtedly going to be extra sales from restaurants because of this, or restaurants are going to take a bigger share of the food budget, let me put it that way, because of this. So I would have thought for the restaurateurs, yes, there's a deadweight loss of cost there, but the aggregate sales volume for them will go up. So it's not surprising to me that the restaurateurs would have been supportive of this. They're supportive of anything that will increase the share of the consumer dollar that the restaurants can get.
Any other comments, or if not, I have another question.
C'est pour compléter.
So I could add to what Mr. Dodge said. Yes, the restaurants are for this measure because it costs less to go to restaurants. So it's not surprising that they are in favor of it. But the purpose of the measure is not to help the restaurant business. The purpose of the measure is to fight against the increase in the cost of living. So really, it's not that we're not going to achieve that objective if we do that.
Thank you.
My other quick question is, the HST agreement between the federal government and the province of New Brunswick says that if the revenue loss is more than 1%, the federal government is required to compensate them. New Brunswick is projecting a tax loss in the amount of around $62 million. Do you think that's enough to trigger legislated compensation?
Colleagues here to answer that. I don't know. That's on.
Sans être un spécialiste.
I'm not a specialist in the agreements that were signed when the harmonized sales tax was set up, but I would say that there was an agreement that the changes should be presented to the provinces before being carried out, and there should be written authorization from the province to reduce the taxable goods. So yes, during COVID, that was a different situation because it was a situation of emergency, but here it's not an emergency. There should have been prior agreement with the provinces, and without that, the federal government well, according to the agreements, it is stated that the federal government should compensate them if the portfolio of goods that is reduced and changes the tax revenue by more than 1%, and that seems to be more than 1% in the tax base here. Because if you look at on the federal side, what they are going to lose based on what they're expected to get without the tax relief, it's about 3%. So really, I think that the provinces should be compensated by the federal government.
No. We have a very good panel, so I understand that why we could have a lot of questions. So the next question, Senator Moreau.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If we had more time, I would ask Mr. Godbout whether the tree behind him to his left is a tree that resembles a Christmas tree. So, Mr. Godbout, my first question is for you in particular. You said that the measure that would have been more equitable and would have reached the same objective would have been to increase the GST rebate. But I'm not familiar with that mechanism, really. I think that it's sent out in check form over the year. Is that right? So here, the idea is to have an immediate effect. So the GST is removed for a certain period of time, in this case between the 14th of December and the 15th of February. So do you think that increasing the GST rebate would have had a better effect than this measure that we're discussing here? So would there have been an immediate effect? That is actually my question. Answer. Right now, we're asking hundreds of thousands of business owners to change their computer system. But if we had asked a single organization, the CRA, to send out a GST rebate to all of the households that are eligible for that rebate, then I think it would have been easier to do. And the people would have had either $250 per individual or $500 per couple. Or we could have chosen whatever amount of the GST rebate they wanted and would have said, listen, all of these people are eligible to receive X amount distributed by the Canada Revenue Agency. So, I mean, it doesn't have to be a check in the mail. It can be an electronic fund transfer. Yes, right now it's not a great idea to send anything by mail, as we all know. So what you're saying that if we had taken this idea of the federal government and if we had provided it to the people who benefit from a GST rebate and asked the CRA to do it, then it would have been more effective. It would have been more simple. It would be simpler, more effective as well, and there would not have been any of the biases that we mentioned, where there's only a 5% break on the Quebec side, a 13% break on the Ontario side, and then people will be going to restaurants in Ontario rather than in Quebec. The GST rebate approach would have been more effective, and in that way we wouldn't be benefiting richer households. Question. I have a question for Mr. Charlevoix. I agree that restaurants underwent the perfect storm. They had to close because of COVID. They lost workers. Their products increased. So I can imagine that restaurants are hungry, if you will, to get back some of the money that they lost and to make up for any losses by charging more for certain products. But is there a way of assessing whether that actually happens, whether prices rise? Answer. Thank you, Senator, for your question. That is what my lab does. We check prices very regularly, and in February we will see whether there has been an opportunistic approach by those who sell food retail. So when it comes to restaurants, yes, it will be a significant benefit in certain provinces. If you have a menu, you can play with prices without people really noticing, and we'll be able to measure the impact. Question, yes, but is there a way of measuring whether whether businesses, be it restaurants or retailers, whether they have gone and occupied the space with regard to the lower prices for consumers because of the tax reduction? Because if we see that after the fact, is there a way to fix it by somehow revising the legislation, for example? Well, we're talking about the laws of the market. So restaurant owners are going to rake it in because there will be a benefit for restaurants because Canadians spend 36% of their food budget in restaurants, and that will likely go up over the 2 months of this tax holiday. And really, every month, we could see whether that there has been an increase in the cost of restaurant prices in January and February, looking at the Consumer Price Index.
Vous avez parlé de l'insécurité alimentaire. Vous avez dit qu'il est temps d'évaluer les possibilités de garantir un revenu minimum. Alors, on sait que le projet de loi C-78 combiné au chèque de 250 $ coûtera 6 milliards de dollars et le directeur du budget dit que le coût serait autour de 3 milliards de dollars net, le coût net. Alors, quels sont les épargnes et les incidences sur la santé, l'éducation, etc. pour les Canadiens dans le besoin, étant donné ce projet de loi versus une mesure prévoyant un revenu garanti de base. Merci pour cette question. Je soutiens donc le revenu minimum garanti. Je crois que le Canada devrait...
sending out checks and submit to the economy an influx of temporary capital. I think it's more important to stabilize the economy with a constant, predictable flow of revenues for households that do need it. So I would prefer certainly to look into a guaranteed minimum income for sure.
Thank you.
Merci. Moi, j'ai une question aussi.
Thank you. I also have a question. Mr. Charlebois, you began to answer it, and it has to do with the choice. And I asked the minister yesterday, who chose the products on the list for tax relief? Because I believe in a healthy mind and a healthy body, and really it's quite the opposite, or it seems to be. So there's tax relief on candies, sweet drinks, alcohol. And if you look at toys, well, there we have the copy of a musical instrument, but not the musical instrument itself. We have shoes, but not dance shoes, not a tutu, no skates. So I find it strange that a Nintendo game was chosen for tax relief rather than a coloring book. A coloring book is specifically excluded from the list of products for tax relief. So I would like to hear what you have to say about the choice. So really we spoke to the officials, and the officials told us that it was the government who decided, but we don't know exactly why, and I'd like to hear your opinion on that. Yes, of course. So I think we all understand that it's a political measure. It's not a well thought out tax measure. I agree with Professor Godbout completely. And here, I focus on food. That's my work. And in the food sector, a number of people are wondering what happened because it seems to encourage people to eat chips and chocolate and that kind of thing. But when it comes to prepared foods, if you have a Caesar salad for 4 people that is taxed, well, I'll get back to this concept of reduflation because it is a tax. It happens when you talk about taxing retail goods, and it's hard to follow. It's temporary, and it's happening during the blackout of food distribution between November to February. Generally, the prices are frozen upstream, but here we're imposing work on grocery stores. It's a huge burden twice and at the busiest time of year. So 40% of the profits is in November and December for flagship stores. And so really, the timing is not great. Thank you, Mr. Godbout. So with regard to the list of products, so if we wanted to remove the taxes on healthy products, is that they were already not subject to tax. And so that would create a problem to say, oh, actually there's no tax on it already, so it was necessary to add products. And so there was the ready-to-eat products. And then other things, I mean, things like soda pop and chips, I mean, imagine. I mean, there's also beer and the taxes that are specific to beer. I mean, that's what shows, or that what makes me say that political issues were top of mind. And what about sports, artistic and cultural goods? Well, those are choices that were made. And if you said that the minister had a hard time defining those choices yesterday, well, I would have even more difficulty than she had because they were based on politics, as far as I'm concerned.
That's okay. Ça va? Vous avez rien à ajouter?
You have nothing to add, Mr. Dodge?
I said, I think it's a very bad idea to chip away at the base of the GST, which is the fundamental way that the government has to continue to raise revenues in the future to pay for its programs. So,
okay. Thank you. J'ai quelques sénateurs aussi, d'autres qui ont demandé.
I have a few other senators who have asked for the floor. Senator Gignac, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all of our expert witnesses for being here and giving us their point of view. What concerns me a little bit is what you said, Mr. Charlebois and Mr. Godbout, is the inequity of the federal government's measures that, according to the province in which Canadians live, there are 5 provinces that are getting less of tax relief than others. So I would like to understand the implications, short-term and long-term, on Revenu Québec, the tax agency in Quebec, because we know that they are responsible for the GST and the provincial sales tax in Quebec. So why would Revenu Québec have to look into whether the tax relief was applied properly in Quebec? Also, there was an agreement that goes back to 2012 with regard to the tax, the provincial tax and the sales tax. Quebec is not a satellite of Ottawa, so do you think that Quebec should perhaps end the agreement that goes back to 2012, especially if they're not compensated? Answer. So there are harmonized sales tax agreements with certain provinces. And for Quebec, it was the day after the Meech Lake Agreement that that Quebec had the agreement about what Quebec does in terms of ensuring that the taxes have been collected properly. And yes, Revenu Québec will have to go to businesses to see whether the GST and the provincial sales tax have been properly collected. Generally, there has to be a follow-up administratively as well, and a notice of assessment. But as far as the details about how the costs for that are shared, I would have to look at the agreement itself. But really, we should really be thinking about taxpayers and ask why the tax relief is different in different provinces. in Quebec in 2012, you mentioned that agreement. So in 2012, when Quebec said we will harmonize the GST and the provincial sale tax, they could have said, well, I'm not going to have a provincial sale tax. I will have HST. But then they would have been less access to its own sales taxes, as happened in Ontario and New Brunswick. I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but I did want to say that it's the first time since the 2012 agreement when Quebec harmonized that the federal government is playing around with the sales tax without consulting Quebec, where Quebec administers and collects the tax for the federal government. I don't know whether there have been agreements on both sides about tax relief for certain products. I'm not sure, but I think there have been over the years for personal hygiene products, for example. But it is possible through legislation, but you have to actually decide. Provinces have to say, okay, our provincial legislation no longer applies. We will use the federal legislation. And the Atlantic provinces, or New Brunswick, for example, and Ontario decided to harmonize and gave up their taxing authority. That wasn't the case for Quebec. Thank you very much. And that ends the round. Senator Mention, do you have a question? Yes, perhaps quickly. My question is about the visible measure, the one where you would use the GST rebate to give people a break. Because it's an invisible measure, and so is the carbon tax rebate. Sorry, it's not a tax. It's the incentive. So you understand what I'm talking about. So these measures do not show up on Canadians' radar. But if you talk about a GST break on certain products, well, then that does make noise. It is visible. What do you have to say about that particular point? Answer. Well, when it comes to tax policy, it's important to try to make good economic and budget decisions for the long term, rather than to try to really draw attention to any breaks that Canadians might be getting. So yes, people like to hear that they're getting a GST break, but they don't know how much money they're actually going to have at the end of the day. And when you look at Quebecers and Ontarians, well, the Quebecers are going to be worse off than Ontarians. And the taxpayers aren't going to be thinking about that in general. I mean, just the Canadians on the street are not necessarily going to break it down. People who know more about tax policy and these things will be calculating how much is actually left afterwards. Answer, yes, but the governments who are leading Canadians should be taking it into account and should be using common sense, should listen to advice about administering taxes or from the finance department, who are not behind the kind of tax relief that we're talking about here. But I wasn't privy to those conversations. Yes. Thank you, witnesses, for having made yourselves available very quickly and for overcoming distance barriers as well. And so without discussing further whether the Christmas tree or Christmas tree-like tree in Mr. Godbout's background is taxable or not, we will now suspend for a couple of minutes to welcome the next panel. Thank you very much.